Well, again, good morning, and praise the Lord. Thank you for being here, and looking forward to sharing my heart with you today. This message is a little deep, if we're honest. It is, because we look at something that we typically don't touch on a whole lot, because we're looking at the difference between in and out. And when we look at this story, it really begins to expose a whole lot of things. And it really begins to cause us to look deep and search within. Surface and depth. We talk about that sometimes in comparative illustrations, water and whatever the case. But it's two different views, surface and depth. What you see here and what you see under here is two very different things. Inside and outside. Two different views, right? What we can see on the outside of a thing and the inside, two very, very different things. It could be the outside of a building, the outside of a room. One place appears one way, while the other can be totally different. One place where it would seem clear as to how things are, while the other exposes what's really there. And that's the differential we see between the inside and the out, the surface and the depth. This observation can apply to pretty much everything, if we're just honest about it. It can apply to everything. It can apply to places, and it can absolutely apply to people. Because on the surface, we can have that vision, that thought, man, it really seems like they got it all together. I mean, they got it all figured out, and they got the great this and the great that, and they got the big smile, and they got the nice family. But yet still on the inside, they're dying. They're drowning. And they hide it well, and they don't really able to express that. Sometimes what we see and what's really going on is two very different things. A very close friend of mine, on the outside, the picture of health and wellness, fitness, a real buff, great-looking guy, and again, but inside, congestive heart failure. And without a transplant, he'll be dead next month. Sometimes what we see is not what's really going on. Oftentimes, this applies in so many different areas of life, and this absolutely applies to our spiritual life. And this is what I want us to look at this morning. Again, a little heavy, a little deep. But this story causes us to see something from a very different perspective. And as we continue looking at the eyes of things through the eyes of Christ, is then this idea of what did Jesus do here? What did Jesus see? He makes it abundantly clear. We begin in this text from Luke 11, and we see so many different things here. And it says, as he was speaking, of course, referring to Jesus himself. It said a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So on the outside, if we continue the illustrative nature of outside and inside, on the outside, we think, okay, he just wants to talk. That seems innocent enough, right? He just wants to talk and just get to know Jesus a little bit more, maybe ask him about some stuff and some questions and all the different things. So that's not a bad thing. There's no concern about that. The outside can oftentimes give an impression. It can be warm, it can be inviting, it can be all these different things. The outside, though, can give an impression that's sometimes not honest. A bear is beautiful, but he'll eat you, right? And so we can sometimes see the understanding of that something can look one way and it not be what it is. And we read that they went in. And so the guy asked him, he said, let's go dine, let's go sit down together. And it reads that they went in. So Jesus, we're telling here now, is reclined at the table. In other words, they sat down to eat, to fellowship, to do what he'd been asked to do, right? So that was what the guy asked him. He said, hey, can we dine together? And that's exactly what was going on. And then we read that the Pharisee was amazed. Now, what does that mean? He was bothered. He was put off. He was troubled, if you will. At the idea, it says that Jesus did not first, in other words, before he sat down, first perform the ritual washing. What are the important words there? Perform and ritual. Okay, so this guy was amazed, again, bothered, put off, offended, if you will, at the idea that this had not been done. Again, the key words here, perform and ritual. Yes, hygiene is important. That's not what we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about, oh man, he didn't wash his hands before. That's not what this is about, okay? Hygiene obviously is a good thing in most cases, but that is not the issue here. Perform equals expected. Expected. And expected equals you are being watched. What you do, how you do it, how you perform, you are being watched. Ritual equals passed down, which equals established, and it's not considered as to why. You just do it. And when we see things that happen that way, ultimately, it pertains to a visual in front of others, which oftentimes does not have a great value. In other words, if you're posed on that, why do you do that? The answer might be, well, I don't know, if we're being honest. But most of the time it's met with, well, that's just what you do. You know, especially some of us that are older, that we've been around, and something that our great-grandparents started that got passed down through, it still happens, right? You do this on this day, or you do this on that. I mean, it just becomes part of our culture. It becomes part of what we're doing here. And so, but it doesn't always equate value. In other words, the outside sometimes is just mere cosmetics, but it does not reveal what's behind it. It's kind of like a mask. You can put a mask on and look a certain way and create a certain character or whatever the case, but it might not be what's really behind it. You know, when I was wrestling, we could wear a mask. I wore lots of them. I had 3 or 4 different characters that I could portray and be that character, but it wasn't really me. It was an act. Sometimes we see that happening a lot in the world today. And we see that in this text, we see the word amazement. Sometimes in this type of expression, it can be words or expressions, but it brings a response from Jesus. Because here we're not saying that, or we're not reading that outwardly the Pharisee said, how dare you sit down and not do the... He didn't say that, but obviously Jesus knew what was going on, and we read that he was amazed. And so Jesus brings a response, and he says, now, you Pharisees. Now he's talking about the attitude that is clearly presented here. Again, whether it's visual expression, whatever. He's talking about the outside visible. He said, you clean the outside of the cup and the dish. In other words, what can be easily seen. All right, so that's again, the surface, the outside, that's easily seen. You pull up and, you've washed the car, man, and it's spit polished and the tires are all shiny from the Armor All. But then you open the door and all the potato chip bags fall out because the whole inside of it is just full of all kinds of stuff. He said it's easy to clean the outside of the cup or the dish. And what was he talking about here? Was he talking about the literal utensils on the table, or was he talking to him about what everybody sees? The robes and the hats and the whatever it is that you've got that gives some type of impression, some type of air about, look at me. I'm all this and I'm all that. Again, the visible, the outside. But then here's what caught my eye. He says, but inside, you're full of greed and evil. Man, that's heavy. Because what he's saying here is what's seen and what's really there is 2 different things. We see a lot of that in the world today. We see a lot of that in the world today. Jesus here is speaking out at the appearance. Again, not merely the cosmetic, but rather giving an appearance of one thing. So that's intentional, okay? Giving an appearance of one thing, but it's not real. Here he is absolutely directly pointing out that religion, in this particular case, has been overtaken, and it no longer contained love and mercy and humility and care and honesty, but rather it presented a character, something being portrayed but it wasn't real at its core. Because here we have those that are parading around and all this flowing, majesty and all this other stuff like that, but it didn't have, it was hollow. It meant nothing. It was like, you find out what's in there, but it wasn't real. And so the phrase here, again, that caught my eye was, but inside. I really thought about that for this message because that's where it counts. Again, what's out, what we can see is one thing, but what's behind it? What's inside of it? Is it hollow? We just had to have a tree removed back here in the back part of the property here because on the outside it was whatever. When you got to realize the whole thing was rotten on the inside, it was no good. Had to go because it was a danger. It could hurt someone if it fell or whatever. Sometimes we still see that going on. And so when I saw those words, but inside, that's where Jesus really looks. Is what's inside. Look at what he says here. He said, you clean outside. In other words, whatever everybody else sees. But inside, it's not just dirty. No, he says it's corrupt. It's rotten. It's evil. And then to a degree, what he's saying is it's dead. It has no value. It can't live because it can't birth anything good from such a place. In other words, what is seen is not real, but it means nothing. It's just surface level. Have you ever talked to someone in life and you hear them saying something and you know they did not mean it? I mean, they either were forced to say it or they felt like they were obligated to say it, but you knew good and well they didn't mean it. It could be an apology. It could be anything. It doesn't matter. We've seen that in life. You can put new paint on a car. You can shine that thing up. But if it's got a blown engine, guess what? It just looks good. That's it. It has no value. It can't go anywhere. It doesn't run. Verse 40, Jesus says, fools. Now, he's not speaking of intelligence here, but rather belief. He's saying, don't you realize? Don't you realize that the one who made the outside made the inside too? What he was trying to say is, why aren't they the same? Because they should be. Because what's out here should represent what's in here, right? That should be an expressive nature of that. But Scripture teaches that what's in the heart will eventually come out, which corrupts what's on the outside, which makes you look like, well, it's not real. And so here he's saying, why aren't they the same? What you show and who you are, well, they don't match. And so he goes on in verse 41, and he says, give them from what is within. Now, he's not talking about money here, friends. That's not what he's talking about at all. He's saying far too many have become obsessed with that today. And I believe that in our world today. Far too many have become obsessed with money. I mean, I saw something this week. It was a little troubling, to be honest with you. It was another place of worship, and I won't mention it, but they had a list of their things that you were required to do. And one of them, which was very disturbing, was they have a fee that you have to pay to be baptized. I'm like, wow, where have we gone? And so, yeah, and it was quite expensive. It was $1,000, in fact. I mean, so it's like, we'll be doing those next week. I'll be taking up, okay, no, because we got to get this carpet paid for. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, I mean, that's the kind. Far too many have become obsessed. When we hear the word give, we instantly go to the bank account. That's not what he was talking about. Jesus was talking about love and kindness and compassion. And he's saying, if that's what lives within you, that shows what's real and it'll come out. Just as if it's not, it won't. And that's what he's trying to get this one in a position to make a difference, to see. I mean, he's confronting the ritual issue here, as it has been already said, and he's confronting this cold and heartless, in name only machine and industry that things had become, and that was never what it was supposed to be. And so that's important we understand what it is that he's trying to make a point of here. He's not just rallying against the system. He's not sticking it to the man. No, he's trying to say, do you see what you're doing? Do you see how this is affecting others in a negative way? It was never supposed to be like this. So what we find as he says, and we've heard these phrases probably over the years being taught, and I think it's important to understand words. Here he says, woe to you Pharisees. Woe to you Pharisees. Now, we hear that and immediately think of some type of warning or even maybe some type of curse or proclamation of something. But friends, it's much, much deeper than that. The word woe, when we understand what that word means, it means overwhelming sorrow. It means suffering. What would bring that to them? He was trying to get them to understand. He was trying to get them to open their eyes, trying to get them to move from looking right to loving right. Because there's a big difference. Because here there's one that's saying, I just want you to check me out, not in a personal or intimate type of way, but look at me as the measuring stick. I'm it. But yes, so there's nothing there. It's hollow. It's no good. And so he's saying here, you give, you give a tenth of all these different things and list out mint and all this other stuff. He says, and you make sure that everybody sees what you do. You make sure that everybody gets a good view of all the things that you do. But he says, but you bypass. Now think about that word. That's intentionally go around. All right? All right? For those of us, and I'm sure Greg's familiar with what I'm about ready to say, you try to bypass Atlanta. Okay, you're going 285 or 275 or whatever, nobody wants to go through the main road, right? That's why we build bypasses so we can avoid the main area. Here, Jesus says you're doing all these things to bypass justice and love for God. So you're drawing all the attention to you. You're drawing all the attention to what you do and what you present, but what you claim to represent. I'm working for God. I'm this and that, whatever. What you outwardly express in your passion for the law and law keeping and all the rules and stuff like that, he said, it's not real. On the inside, it's just a show. It's rotten, it's evil, it's corrupt, it's not real. So what you're telling everybody and what you actually do is two very, very different things. And that is a problem. And that's what he's trying to point out here. It's a show. And he says, whoa, this is pointing the attention toward the understanding that here's the woe, the suffering and the severe sorrow. If that's where you stay, it's not going to end well for you. It's not about what the expression and what other people receive. It's about you. You're the one that is just, in essence, I guess, digging your hole deeper. If you continue to stay where you are, the woe is what's coming to you. And what we need to look at is that's much more a consequence rather than a punishment. I did it. If I won't stop this, that, or the other, or if I won't do this, that, what brings that on? And he's trying to get him to see, look at what you're doing. This is not working. You're not presenting the things in the way that they need to be done. This is not a critique of the teaching method as much as it's not going to benefit you. You're proclaiming all this other stuff and you're doing all this stuff, but it's not going to help you and it will not end well. In verse 42, we see what it results in, neglecting others. You become so bound by all the different things and you are not seeing how it pertains to others and why it even matters to others. He says in verse 42, he says, you bypass the justice and your love for God and these things you should have done without the neglecting of others. I mean, he's telling them this is where it is presenting you. This is where it is putting you. Again, you're too busy looking right. You're too busy with the show, making sure that everything's okay while everything else is being neglected and being done without, and you've lost all concern about that because it's all about the show. Now it's all about the facade. We got to keep this up. You know, again, and I've said it before, and I don't want to be repetitive, but I had someone standing in a beautiful auditorium one time tell me, you see all these seats in here? I said, yeah, it's great, it's beautiful. Whatever it takes to fill every one of them up. That's what we do. Well, that could be very shallow. And again, that's not a jealousy statement. Sure, we'd all love to have the room full. okay? But if we sin, what are you doing to get it there? Because, you know, what's the surface? What's the real? That's what we're seeing here. So this wasn't a rebuke as much of the manner of serving, but rather the heart behind it. Okay? Because we can get off into the weeds about how everybody does it. This person's loud, this person's this person that, and we can get into the critique about styles and methods and beliefs and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, what Jesus is looking at is what's on the inside. What is the heart behind it? Why are they doing it? You know, are they doing it for the right reasons? And that just happens to be that they're more excitable. You know, are they doing it for the right reasons? And they happen to be a little more reverent? Or are they rotten and evil and corrupt on the inside? That's what Jesus sees. It's not about the surface. The surface is what it is. The cosmetics are what it is. I mean, you know, a lot of us have seen stuff that looks good. And then when you look behind it, it's like, oh, that's terrible, you know? I've seen people that look good and then they took off all the makeup and they'll scare you to death. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, we see stuff on the surface that's not always what it looks to be. And so here, it wasn't so much a rebuke about how they were serving, rather the heart behind it. And he's telling them if it remains in that place, it will not lead to anything good for you. Because this is what he was trying to get to understand. You are the problem here. Verse 43, it goes on. And he says, woe to you Pharisees, you love the front seat. You love the front seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace. In other words, you love the attention. You do. Man, you like that attention. You love it when you walk in the door and everybody stops what they're doing. You love the attention. You love the title. You love the status. But you've forgotten why you do what you do. That's important. That's important because sometimes people, and again, it's not trying to be overly critical of others, but sometimes people do get caught up in those things, you know, whether it's celebrity or whether it's notoriety or any of those other things. And it's not that those things necessarily have to be wrong. But I remember one time a very, very famous person in ministry, and I'm not going to name names, but they had a very public fall, if you want to call it that. I mean, they made a mess of their whole life, and they never really recovered from it, to be honest. But I remember them sharing that one time in a writing, and they said they were praying and seeking the Lord about, you know, trying to get their life back together and being restored and whatever the case. And because they had become so famous and so world-known, he was saying, you know, why did this have to be so ugly? And so public and so embarrassing and this and that. And he said he felt in his spirit, the Lord answered him and said, because you wouldn't listen any other way. You know, it's like many of us that grow up, of course, in this area of the world, you know, you got too big for your britches. That was what my mother used to say when you got out of hand and you wouldn't be able to listen. And he says here, you love the front seat. You love what you do, but you've forgotten why you do it. Do we see how that's important today? Do we see why that matters, especially in this circle of what we're talking about? He says, and then it gets a little heavier. He says, you were like unmarked graves. Now, what does that mean? Why would that be important? He said, the people walk over and don't even know it. Why would that be it would be very significant to them. Because he was speaking, again, this is a pointed statement to her, because in that time, we have to understand historically, in that time, walking over or touching a grave was believed to make someone unclean. That was a big no-no. All right, you didn't do that. You tried to avoid that at all costs. So the graves were clearly marked, or in some cases they were whitewashed or painted to prevent that. They wanted everybody to not do that. He says here, not only in this woe, but he calls them unmarked graves. What was he saying here? He was telling them, no one considers you a danger, yet you are. No one would consider not touching you or coming by you or walking over you because you don't appear that way. The unmarked grave, no one knows it's there. They just keep right on going, right? They don't see any danger. They don't see any problem. And the danger, though, is if what you contain or what you cover up is death. Think about that, because what does a grave cover? Death, right? And he's saying, you don't let anybody know that, so you are an unmarked grave. And that meant something to that culture, Because if you were concerned about, man, I know where there's a cemetery over there, I'm going to, not just in reverence, but I'm not going to walk over that grave. I know people that way today. From superstition purposes, they wouldn't do it. But here, this was a big, big thing. And people were, oh, you're unclean. And you can't, because when you got unclean, you can't be around people for this long. And I mean, it changes everything. So it was a serious thing. And he was telling them, you are like an unmarked grave, and you appear outwardly as not in need of a warning, and that is deceptive. But you love the attention, and you no longer see the needs of others. This remains alive today. And this is important that he's trying to get one to see this. So here, Jesus is pointing toward the issue of policy becoming more important than the very people who are looking for them and looking at them for guidance, because they were supposed to be the spiritual people of the day, right? They were supposed to be the leaders, the ones that could show people the things of God. And he's saying, but you're not doing that. So he's speaking here against the system, if you will. And these are the ones, again, seen in this position. And then we read that one of the experts in verse 45, one of the experts in the law kind of chimed in, and he remember, Jesus had dealt with them before. You know, one of the experts in the law said, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus said, well, what does the law say? And he says, well, love God and love one another. He says, you got it. That's it. Just do that and you'll live. Well, that just messed up his whole day, and we did a whole message on that. But here, the expert in the law, he's chiming in, and he says to Jesus, you know, you're kind of insulting us too here when you're talking like this, because, I mean, hey, we're the purveyors of all these things, and what you're saying, well, I mean, you're kind of pointing us out too, right? What does this tell us? This tells us at least a little bit, to some degree, that there's some level of conviction here of like, hey, wait a minute, that guy's talking about me too. He's not leaving me out of the equation. Again, I love that. I mean, I hold this stuff to the letter. There's no exemptions, no room for grace. The offender must go down, and it must go down hard. So Jesus, as I said in the reading earlier, being equal opportunity, he said, well, woe to you experts in the law then. We can find some comedy in that a little bit, but it's serious, because he was telling them, okay, you want to chime in, let's get you involved in the story as well. What you're doing, the things that you're placing on people are impossible. And you yourselves are not even following it, right? You're creating all this stuff and putting all this burden on people, and yet still you are creating something that's impossible. You load people, he says, with burdens, things that are hard to carry out, and yet you yourself do not touch these with one of your fingers. In other words, what? Hypocrite. Hypocrite. He would later call them that. Hypocrites and broods of vipers. He wasn't being wrong. He wasn't being ugly. He wasn't being name-calling or judgmental. He was pointing out what was necessary to get them to open their eyes. His correction, just like should be corrections for children, should be done out of love, not out of being hateful and mean. And here he's saying, you expect everybody to do all of this stuff that you come up with, and yes, you don't do it. Stephen would call that out and get stoned. All the things that you make people do or try to get people to do, and it took his life. He's saying here, your demands and your corrections, well, they don't apply to you. How could that possibly be fair? But that takes us back to the first part of this message. Remember, bypass justice. So it doesn't apply to me. Do as I say, not do as I do. We have that happen all the time. We see it all the time, because here Jesus came to show care and love and concern and to make it clear that burdens are real, life is real, but he offers relief. He offers answers. He wanted that to be clear. And here he's telling these experts, these law enforcers, if you will, and these ones with the ability, he said, you're not just not keeping all the burdens in place, but you're adding more. You keep making the list longer. What are you doing? Nobody can handle this. So we have to see, again, this message today, it kind of creates two trains of thought. Are we making Jesus easier to be found? Or are we creating a system he never started? Because that's two different things. And oftentimes what we find is the latter being true more than the former. He said, you build tombs for the prophets. In other words, statues, memorials, monuments, all this stuff. Outside, you revere these things. The institution and this, we hear all this stuff even today. You revere these things, he says, but yet still, as you hold them in high esteem, your fathers killed them. What was he saying? It's not real. You don't mean it. Therefore, what you're doing is moving toward the same issue that's still here. You're holding on to this stuff. The same reason that all of these people were rejected and killed remains alive in you. Why? You hated opposition. You hate truth. What was he pointing us toward here? What was he showing us? What is he painting a picture of? This will ultimately lead to the cross. The very things that he was trying to show them, the very things that they opposed, the very things they wanted nothing to do with, well, that was exactly what would put him where he would end up. Again, outwardly they claimed to honor those from the past, but they ignored everything they stood for. They ignored everything that they taught. Well, that kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's kind of, we revere the things from the past, but yet still none of it gets applied because, well, it was this, that, or that. And we see the same thing here. Some seek why a lot these days. Why this, why that? We see a lot of that stuff today. And rightfully so. We should ask a lot of questions about a whole lot of things. But verse 49, we see something important here. He says, because of this, the wisdom of God says, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets since the foundation of the world. All right, so he says, many claim, and he makes it clear here, that those that have been sent with the message from God, that their death would expose the heart of the rejecter. That's pretty clear. And that's pretty strong when we begin to understand here. So he tells them, this generation will be held responsible. Will be held responsible. Is this a warning or a consequence? If you keep doing what you're doing, it's never going to end well. I think we could take a great lesson in that in the nation today. There's a lot of things, again, I'll never ever try to get political, but you keep going down the same road, you'll find out. That's just how it's going to work. And this is what he's telling them. I'm giving you the truth. I'm giving you the answer. You won't have to listen if you don't want to. But I'm telling you, it will not end well. And that's been proven over time. The Pharisees don't even exist anymore. That's a gone thing now. And so we see that the absolute truth was exposed. Because who was the bad guys at the crucifixion? They were, without a doubt. Verse 52, the second woe, if we will. He says, woe to you experts in the law. You have taken away the key to knowledge. You didn't go in yourself, and you hindered those who were trying to go in. Wow. Think about that for a minute. Think about what he's saying here. An intentional act. You took it away. You didn't want anybody else to know. So you got in the way, and you made it all about you. You didn't want anybody to know the truth. You covered it up. You got in the way of all this different stuff. Institutions, systems, industries. What do they always do? They almost always create walls. They always hide secrets. And in the end, they don't help. They don't help, but rather they hinder one from looking at the truth, from finding out the truth. And here Jesus tells the experts, the Pharisees, you hindered those who were trying to go in. The woe here is, you created sadness for so many through what should be joy. Because what are we to proclaim? The good news, right? The good news. But when we add but, here's the good news. But, and you get this whole list of this and that, well, it don't seem so good anymore. He's trying to get them to understand the value of what we do and why we do it. And this should be an issue. And when the message of Christ gets piled under a bunch of stuff that he never said or started, it hinders. It keeps those from seeing what it was that he was doing. And so he left, he says, He said what he needed to say. He made it clear. He said what he needed to say. And then we notice, who did he get stern with in all of the times that he had to say something? Those in positions to help. That's who he talked to, the harshest and the sternest, because he's saying, take it serious. It is so easy to judge others. It is so easy to point fingers. It is so easy to grab that low-hanging fruit and condemn and ridicule and make all these spiritually sounding and biblically sounding comments and act all high and mighty and tell everybody how wrong they are. But what about the one talking? That's what he's saying. Look in the mirror. You've heard me say mirror moments many, many times over these last few years. What does their mirror show? That's what he's talking about. And oftentimes, we find that it shows something that's actually been trying to be covered up. You know, we see the reality of these things. And so here, I mean, he's ever heard this old statement, if you live in a glass house, don't throw stones? He's just making it really clear to him, friends. And when he left this thing, his message was clear. There was really nothing else to say. This is an issue that he's leaving, and this is what should have been contemplated and what we should contemplate today. It starts with the messenger. It really does. It starts with the messenger. Well, they didn't want to hear that, so we read what happened. They didn't like what he said. It tells us they fiercely opposed him. They immediately went on the defensive wheel. Because why? Because he was right. Isn't that what we do? When we hear something we don't want to hear, we get all defensive, we get all mad, we scream, we slam doors, we run up the stairs, we do all the different stuff that we need to do, and all the different things that happen in this life. That's how we act, right? That's what was going on here. They didn't want that. But pride would never allow them to admit that. Never. And so very, very much alive right now in this time that we're living in. And we read, they were lying in wait. Those are criminal terms. Think about the concept of that, lying in wait. When there's a criminal charge and they add the word to it, premeditated, that makes it a lot more serious. You thought about it before you did it. Lying in wait, it tells us, it really says a lot about their heart. They were just waiting. They couldn't stand it. They couldn't wait to try to find some kind of way to get them. I've worked a few crimes like that where people were waiting on someone to get home so they could hurt them or assault them, lying in wait. I've seen that. And here we find that they were lying in wait, and they thought about it, and it says they wanted to trap him. Trap him. In other words, the aha moment. We got you now. We got you now. You said it now. But what does that prove? Everything that he had just said was true. This shows their heart. The exposure of what was really, really going on. Friends, here it is. Jesus still looks at the inside. That's it. He still looks at the inside. Your cup, my cup, it may be spotless on the outside. It may be. But if the inside is filled with dust and bugs and trash, then the water that we offer is contaminated. We got to understand that. That's what's the simplistic version of what's being said here. And I'll close with this quote. I saw this week. It says, the Pharisees were upset with Jesus because he saw what no one else did. He saw beyond the robes and the titles and the outward appearance, and he saw what was real. And he can still see what's real today. I believe that. He can still see what's real today. So something needs changing in your life. We all have room for improvement, right? Everybody could do a little bit better. Again, that's not a shaking finger at anybody. We can all do a little better. All do a little bit better. If something needs changing, that's okay. Today's a good day to think about that. How do I get there? How do I make sure my cup is clean on the outside and the inside? So if we know it needs to be changed, don't wait. Start working on that. Just make that first step toward that direction. Because think of it like this. The car is still running. But if the oil is going bad, If that's ignored long enough, it'll eventually quit. What did Jesus see? He sees the check engine light before it comes on. That's what we need to start doing. Look inside. See what's really going on. We don't have a closing song today, so we're going to pray as we wrap things up today. And just consider what we've talked about. I pray it's been a blessing to you. I really thought a lot about this message as we put it together this week. And I always say we because there's nobody else writing it with me, but the Lord does guide my heart. At least I try my best to listen about what's the point of what's this story, what's really going on. And as we think about things today, as we look at the condition of life in the world and all the stuff going on around us, I think it's important that we look at those two words, but inside. What's really going on in here? And I think we have to be honest about that with ourselves and with the things around us, because we see a lot of characters, a lot of masks, a lot of falsehoods, a lot of different things. Not, again, creating that from a judgmental standpoint, but rather than realistic. A lot of stuff that we see, it's like, wait a minute, that's not what I thought. It's because that's what you saw. He's saying turn that to yourself and make sure that what you see is who you are. And I believe that's so, so important today, is be real. Father, we thank you for being with us today. Thank you for those who have gathered. I pray that what we've done has been a blessing, Lord. It's sometimes life is a struggle. Sometimes we wrestle with so many different things. And we've been shown clearly, Lord, that Jesus held the answer in the teachings that he gave and the life that he lived and the examples that he left. And I just pray, Lord, that we can turn to that more and more and more and understand the beauty of what we've been given and the foundation that we can build on. And Lord, if there's one here today that doesn't know that in a clear way, I pray that they would pursue that and understand the value of the relationship that comes with knowing Christ. And Lord, if there's one here that is struggling today with life, as many of us are in so many different ways, and maybe even seeking answers beyond our understanding, we pray for clarity, that different things would open, different channels, different doors, different opportunities would open to allow those things to be clear. And Lord, as we just leave here today, we pray, Lord, for safety for all those that are traveling and not with us today, and for all those maybe who have different things going on this week, and those that are unable to be with us for health reasons. We just pray for a touch of healing and peace in their life. And we just thank you for answering those things in your time, and just pray, Lord, that we would be patient in waiting. And we thank you and love you, and we ask it all in Christ's name. And we all said, amen.